discuss the impacts of AI on our democracy, privacy, and civil rights. Please welcome Katie Harbath, CEO of Anchor Change, and Alexandra Reeve Givens, President and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, joined by David Ewalt, Science and Technology Editor at The Messenger.
So this is, I think, a particularly interesting topic right now because we're at this unprecedented moment where we've got an emerging technology that is doubtlessly going to change our democracy and the way we work. And it's emerging during a period of intense political change and a big election year. So let's set the stage before we get into the details of how that's going to work. When it comes to threats to democracy and AI, what are the horror stories? Let's put people straight up in their seats. Like, what do you worry about when you hear, okay, AI, this is what it's going to do to democracy? What's the worst case?
Well, I think that for me, the worst case at the moment is just the sheer number of elections happening next year and the number of areas and surface areas that this can unfold in a lot of different ways. So next year is an unprecedented number of elections where it's first time in the same year as a US presidential. You'll have elections in India, Indonesia, Taiwan, maybe Ukraine, Mexico, the United Kingdom, European Union. I'm tracking 83 elections across 78 countries right now. And so that's a lot of languages, a lot of just different places, and a lot of places where we might take our eye off the ball where foreign adversaries are going to be able to potentially use this technology to try to change how elections happen in those places.
And I very much agree. And one of the things that gets the most airtime is the risk of deepfakes, right? Manipulated images or audio that mislead people about what a particular candidate has said and done. That's hugely important and we should talk about it. But I also worry about how AI is going to make it so much easier to target people with specific messages in far more personalized ways than we've seen before. So in previous elections, we've seen voter interference campaigns done by text message, by email campaigns, sometimes quite generic language. It's the same with a scam. It's easier to tell that it's a fraud or manipulated image. But here, where you're able to generate content at speed and at scale for a very low cost, not only can you target that message, but you can more authentically develop coordinated campaigns. So somebody is getting a targeted piece of misinformation, and there may also be ads generated that reinforce that misinformation. They may be seeing it on other platforms too, all of which together undermine our information environment in worrying ways.
All right, so that's some of the worst case scary stuff. Can we have some positive? Like when you look at these emerging technologies, what are the positive things that this might do for our democracy?
So voice is important, right? And finding new ways for people to express themselves and to create content is valuable. We need to be careful about the guardrails, but I think about this very benign application. I have an 8-year-old son who loves using generative AI to create images for fun, to illustrate his stories. You can think about campaigns starting to use generative tools to improve the quality of their materials, right? So as the resource enhancer, efficiency enhancer, kind of the productivity tool that I think is the best case scenario for those. Mm-hmm. Of course, we need to make sure that they're used responsibly, that doesn't go into a position of using manipulated images to misrepresent your opponent. Right. But when you think about the basics of campaign literature for your average person running for a local office without a big budget, there are real benefits there that can help them.
Sure.
I'm glad you're bringing up both because my mantra going into next year is to panic responsibly.
Right.
I have to show the shirt. But for me, like I also look at this for how AI can be used for content moderation, for detecting this type of content, for even being able, not even AI generated content, but harmful content overall. AI can continue to help speed up those processes for many of these companies. Mm-hmm.
So let's get a little bit into, you mentioned that this is a big year for elections all over the globe. We're going to spend a lot of time, I think, 11 minutes, talking about US and what's happening here. But there's interesting things happening overseas. You mentioned India and what's going on with Modi. How is approach to AI in other countries, not just them maybe being negative actors, but how will the vote and how other countries are approaching AI themselves, how is that going to affect what's happening here?
Well, I think that you'll see a lot of these countries be looking to what is happening in the United States and potentially copying some of those tactics in their own elections, and maybe also vice versa of what happens. Many of these countries are also potentially passing regulation on it. The EU is looking at that, other places as well. India, as you mentioned, they want social media companies to have to take down deepfakes after 24 hours. Or within 24 hours. There's a concern, though, that that could be used to silence opposition voices, and what that might look like. And depending upon how all these other countries handle this, platforms might choose to take action for the entire globe rather than just doing it in a single individual country. And so I kind of use the metaphor of a kaleidoscope for next year, because there's so many bits and pieces that could play off of one another and could impact one another as we go through that entire year, that it's even kind of hard to paint the picture because there's so many different options of what could happen.
So should we be raising alarm bells? I mean, you're talking about panicking responsibly. Alexandra, we have members of Congress who showed up here today. There's a lot of congressional staffers who've been in the audience. What should our message be to them? Where do they need to take action right now? What's our first steps?
So on the elections piece, I will actually say, usually I'm a proponent saying, Congress, you need to act immediately. On this one, Congress needs to be paying attention, but the election season is upon us right now. Right. So I actually think that cannot be a distraction from the very real actions that we need to see by companies, which I think hopefully we'll talk about on the stage today. That said, Congress still plays an important role, raising awareness about harms, looking at what our campaign finance laws should apply to the appropriate uses and speech and conduct of candidates for political office, which is kind of one point in the ecosystem. So I do think that there's work here, and Senator Klobuchar and others have introduced legislation on these topics that's hugely important. And the Federal Elections Commission is considering potentially opening a proceeding. But to pull back to that bigger point, the legislation is valuable, but really what we need to see now is leadership from a couple different players in the ecosystem. What's interesting is that Katie was talking about the distribution of mis and disinformation and targeted ads, which actually is sometimes different than the generative AI conversation. The models that are allowing people to create manipulated images, allowing people to create manipulated text. Sometimes there's overlap, but sometimes it's a distinct set than the places where that mis and disinformation is actually being spread. And one of the things I think is essential in this conversation is that we talk not just about what should be the rules on what DALL-E can and can't generate. That gets complicated and runs into the First Amendment pretty quickly. But the most important thing is how is that information being disseminated and distributed, and how much of the platform's paying attention. And the reality is we're at a moment where many of the social media companies are scaling back their investments in their trust and safety teams. We've seen a significant scale back from the actions that kind of came after 2016 and 2020. And there is a culture right now of really strong political scrutiny and targeting of some of the independent researchers and independent actors that study this field and help raise the alarm bell to counter mis and disinformation. There are congressional investigations, there's litigation, all of which is having a significant chilling effect on that ecosystem. So we need to think about this in a robust way where legislation is a piece of the puzzle, but also letting people do their jobs in trust and safety is a really critical component as well.
If I can add 2 points to that. One is it's not just the legacy companies that are having to deal with this. There are many newer companies who have not had to build up these policies and these tools. And how trust and safety works in AI is different questions than it is maybe what the social media platforms have had to do before. For instance, for AI, do you allow people to search, for instance, tell me all of the candidates' positions for president on abortion? That to me seems like it could be a really helpful thing for me rather than having to go to every single one of their sites. Well, what if they might get that wrong? What if it doesn't pull it on all the right stuff? Do you just not allow that altogether? How do you define that? Those are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about as well and understanding. The second point I just want to make is that the distribution of this content is not just online. It is offline as well. These ads can appear on broadcast, on cable, in newspapers, on radio. And so we need to be thinking about this as sort of a whole of information ecosystem approach and not just be thinking about how it's distributed on online platforms.
The point about having these new companies, new entrants have to deal with trust and safety norms, I think is really critical. Because we're starting to see, so many of us have been putting public pressure on members of Congress too, to say, to OpenAI and to others, what are you doing about this? And we're starting to see some of them release election policies around usage, around content that can and can't be generated. So some, for example, will say an image of a current political figure cannot be manipulated on their service. Others will say, if it looks like you are using our service to create targeted content, targeted political ads based on demographic information, that's not a permitted usage. That's important, but right now they're scrambling very fast to write those, and not doing it, I would argue, with the same level of depth and rigor that has happened, matured over the years in the field of social media platforms having to do that. So there is a field of trust and safety professionals now who think about what those disclosures should look like. There's a process for multi-stakeholder input on what your usage policy or your content policies should be. There's transparency reporting, where we have demanded over the years that companies publicly disclose how their usage and content policies are enforced. The generative AI companies have to be on a really fast learning curve to pick up and adopt all of those best practices and hopefully get it better than we've seen the social media companies do so far.
So I'm going to take questions from the audience in a second, so get your questions ready. But before we get to that, it seems to me that a lot of what we're talking about here deals with the fundamental issue of having an educated electorate. We're talking about misinformation. One of the best ways to combat misinformation is to have voters who understand, oh, this is an AI that's texting me, or that really can perceive what's going on around them. So I guess this gets to the question of how can we do better to educate people about AI and misinformation? What do we need to do?
So I'm going to give you a yes and, which is that educating the public matters. We cannot let ourselves off the hook by saying that that is the answer. It's the same way that we can't say, well, there are privacy policies and people, they consent when they click, I accept. Users are not empowered to actually navigate this environment in the current landscape. So yes, of course, we need civics education. We need it from K all the way through to adults and family members and all of the things. But at the same time, we need to think about other ways to boost trusted sources of information. So we need trust and safety teams doing their job. We also need election officials empowered and resourced to boost authoritative sources of information when it comes to elections. So for example, there was a big movement to make sure that information about where your polling location is, where you can vote, that your poll is still open, is surfaced on the major social media companies. We have to make sure that the generative AI companies are surfacing that information and going to credible sources too. We have to train election officials to pre-bunk information, to know, create themselves as authentic, trusted voices in the space so that reporters and the public know to go to them. There's some really low-hanging fruit here, and I think particularly given staffers in the audience, it's useful underscoring it. My organization, CDT, did a research study and found that only 1 in 4 election officials are using .gov as their domain. And that matters, right? Because not just anyone can get a .gov domain. It shows that it's trusted. It shows that it's a real source of information. But places are still, referring like springfieldvotes.com to get your official information about voting in Springfield. That's just an example. Or not even, that's a hypothetical. But so there's low-hanging fruit like that we could go for too, to really make sure that people know what those trusted sources of information are, to help a little bit in this kind of confusing landscape.
I also think there's a role for media and other influencers. I'm very nervous about just the impact of the narrative of what AI could do. So your question about what's the most horrible thing? That's the most horrible thing I can dream up. It's not necessarily that it's going to come true. And so I think that we should be, again, concerned and watching and thinking about these things, because we didn't do that with social media when it first came out. So I'm very glad we're having these conversations now. But even just having that can sow distrust in the public about what the impact of AI could be on the electoral process and what happens and things of that nature. And so how do we better help them to understand the signal from the noise of what is actually happening versus what could happen?
Well, we're almost out of time, but I did say I was going to take a question from the audience, so if there's a quick one. I think I saw the gentleman's hand go up first.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk on some of the engagement that social media, that AI can create, the personalized, targeted content, et cetera. Social media companies and ad-based companies have an incentive to increase engagement, which could lead to some bad outcomes. What should those companies, trust and safety departments, but also what should the public and other sectors do to counteract that misaligned incentive?
Oh my gosh, that's like the bajillion-dollar question that I think we've all been asking ourselves for quite some time. I do think you are seeing, one thing is that you are seeing different platforms try out different models of what this looks like. with engagement versus not, different design models. And I don't know how much we'll see before we go into 2024, but I think more questions around, I keep going back to transparency and oversight. We still don't have a full picture of what is exactly happening on all these platforms, which is why transparency is important for researchers, for us to understand that. And then nobody likes the thought of the companies being in charge or the government, of any one entity being in charge. So how do we keep building out a system of checks and balances to make sure that we are holding each other accountable for the decisions that we're making? And I think, again, none of this is going to happen in the next year, but that's where I would like to see more and more of the conversation go as we think about this.
And pass the federal privacy law.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you both so much for your time. We'll leave it with that. Thank you.